The corridor was chaos, laughter bouncing off walls, steel doors crashing, officers barking orders. Then everything shifted when the old man walked through. Silver hair, worn jumpsuit, steady eyes that had witnessed decades of storms. "Yo, check this out. Grandpa's here." One of them sneered. Another pushed off the wall, stepping directly into his path. "Where you headed, fossil?" The shove came hard. The old man fell, his meal tray scattering across concrete like shrapnel. The corridor erupted with laughter. The bullies didn't notice how still he was on the ground. No anger, no panic, just breathing, controlled, precise. When he finally stood, something shifted in the air. The laughter died because the way he moved wasn't how an old man moved. One step, a pivot, a strike, and in seconds, the largest bully hit the floor, choking for air. Nobody laughed now. Even the guards froze, trying to understand what just happened. Because this wasn't just some frail elderly inmate. He was a national Taekwondo champion, a man who trained his body to withstand agony and his mind to stay razor sharp. Stay with me until the end, because what he does next will remind every man in that prison why you never mistake silence for weakness. Before we begin, don't forget to like this video. Hit subscribe and comment where you're watching from. Now let's get into it. The iron gates of Ridgemont Federal Correctional Institution had consumed thousands of men over the decades. Most arrived furious, hopeless, or shattered. But when 72-year-old William Torres walked through those gates on that Wednesday morning, he carried himself differently. His shoulders were squared despite the gravity of his situation. His steps were measured, deliberate. The intake officer barely looked up from his computer as he processed another elderly defendant caught up in the system. What the officer couldn't see was the quiet hurricane brewing beneath that weathered exterior. William had spent 52 years mastering the art of Taekwondo. He'd competed at national championships, trained future Olympians, and earned his 9th-degree black belt through decades of dedication that most men couldn't fathom. His academy had been his temple, his students, his extended family, and his philosophy, his legacy. Now he was inmate number 84571, facing 24 months behind bars for securities fraud charges that had finally caught up with him. The courtroom had been filled with former students who sobbed as the sentence was read. They knew what the world was losing, but more importantly, they knew what the prison was gaining. Cell Block D was governed by brutality and terror. The unofficial hierarchy was straightforward and savage. Jerome Crusher Davis sat at the top, a mountain of fury and muscle who'd been running things for 7 years. His crew moved through the corridors like wolves, taking what they wanted, destroying who they pleased. The guards looked the other way because Crusher maintained a certain order to the madness. Better to let him handle discipline his way than deal with constant uprisings and bloodshed. When word spread that fresh meat was arriving, Crusher's interest peaked immediately. New inmates meant new opportunities to remind everyone exactly who controlled things in Block D. The older they were, the faster they crumbled, and crumbling people was Crusher's specialty. William's first week passed in relative silence. He kept to himself, reading novels from the modest library, writing letters to his son, and maintaining the meditation routine he'd followed for decades. His cellmate was an anxious young man named Anthony, who'd been counting down the hours until his release. Anthony watched the old man with curiosity and growing admiration. "You're different from the others," Anthony whispered one night after lights out. "Most new guys, they're either terrified out of their minds or trying to act hard from day one. You just seem peaceful about everything." William closed his book and set it carefully on the small shelf beside his bunk. "Fear clouds judgment, Anthony. Anger destroys focus. When you've spent your life training your mind to find stillness in chaos, prison becomes just another place to practice." Anthony didn't fully understand what the old man meant, but something in William's voice made him feel safer than he had in months. There was a quiet power there, a certainty that came from somewhere deeper than bravado or desperation. The confrontation everyone was anticipating came on a Friday morning. William had developed a routine of walking the corridors during free time, partly for exercise, partly to observe the dynamics that governed this concrete ecosystem. He moved with purpose, but without aggression, nodding respectfully to other inmates who met his eyes, avoiding the territorial disputes that erupted daily. Crusher had positioned himself and four of his crew members near the main corridor intersection, a strategic location where every inmate had to pass. It was a dominance display, a visual reminder of the hierarchy that existed in this place. When William approached, carrying his small bag of personal items from the commissary, Crusher knew the moment had arrived. "Well, well, well," Crusher's voice thundered through the corridor, causing conversations to stop and heads to turn. "Look what we got here, fellas. Somebody's great-grandfather decided to take a stroll through my territory." William continued walking, his pace steady, his expression unchanged. He had dealt with bullies before, though admittedly not in quite this environment. The principle remained the same: show no fear, but avoid unnecessary confrontation when possible. Crusher stepped directly into William's path, his massive frame blocking the way forward. His crew flanked him on both sides, grins spreading across their faces as they anticipated the entertainment. This was how dominance was established and maintained in their world. "I'm talking to you, old-timer," Crusher growled, his voice dropping to a menacing whisper. "When somebody speaks to you in here, you show respect. That's how things work around here." William stopped walking and looked up at Crusher calmly. "I heard you," he said simply. "I just don't see what we need to discuss." The response caught Crusher off guard. Most inmates either cowered immediately or tried to puff up and act tough. This old man was doing neither. He was just standing there, completely unimpressed by the display of intimidation. "You don't see what we need to discuss," Crusher repeated, his voice getting louder. "Maybe you don't understand the rules yet. See, I run this block. Everything that happens here goes through me, including where some old fool gets to walk." William remained perfectly still, his breathing slow and controlled. Years of meditation and training had taught him to find calm in the center of any storm. This was just another storm, no different from the tournaments where opponents tried to intimidate him with size and aggression. "I understand you're in charge," William said quietly. "I'm just trying to get back to my cell." Crusher's face flushed crimson with anger. The old man's calm was making him look weak in front of his crew, in front of the growing crowd of inmates who had stopped to watch the show. That couldn't stand. Without warning, Crusher reached out and shoved William hard in the chest. The force should have sent the elderly man stumbling backward, maybe even knocked him down entirely. But William's feet seemed anchored to the floor. He absorbed the impact with a slight shift of weight and remained standing exactly where he had been. Crusher blinked in surprise. He had put real force behind that shove, enough to move men half his age. But the old man hadn't budged an inch. "Did you just ignore my push?" Crusher started to say, but William cut him off with a look that made the gang leader's words die in his throat. For just a moment, William's mask of calm slipped, and Crusher caught a glimpse of something that made his blood run cold. It was like looking into the eyes of a predator that had been pretending to be prey. The moment stretched like a wire under tension. Crusher stared into William's eyes and felt something he hadn't experienced in years behind bars: uncertainty. The old man's gaze held depths that spoke of training, discipline, and a quiet confidence that came from knowing exactly what he was capable of. But Crusher was the king of Cell Block D. Kings don't back down from challenges, especially not from some elderly man who probably couldn't jog a lap without collapsing. "You think you're tough, old-timer?" Crusher snarled, stepping closer until he was towering over William. "You think those brittle bones can stand up to what I got waiting for you?" William's response was barely above a whisper. "I think you should step aside and let me pass." The corridor had gone completely silent now. Every conversation had stopped. Even the guards at the far end of the hall had noticed something was happening, though they weren't moving to intervene. Not yet. This was how things worked in here. Let the inmates sort it out themselves until blood started flowing. Crusher's crew was getting restless. They fed off their leader's energy, and right now that energy was building towards something explosive. One of them, a stocky man with prison tattoos covering his arms, stepped forward eagerly. "Crusher, you want me to teach Grandpa some manners?" he said, cracking his knuckles. "Show him how we welcome new fish around here?" But Crusher held up a massive hand. This was personal now. The old man's calm was eating away at his authority with every second that passed. He needed to end this himself, decisively and brutally in front of everyone. "Nah," Crusher said. never taking his eyes off William. "I got this one myself." What happened next would be whispered about in cell blocks for years to come. Crusher drew back his enormous right fist, putting every ounce of his 275 pounds behind a punch designed to shatter the old man's jaw. It was the kind of blow that had dropped men half Crusher's age, the kind that ended fights before they really began. William saw it coming from the moment Crusher's shoulder tensed. 52 years of martial arts training had given him an understanding of body mechanics that went beyond conscious thought. The punch was powerful but telegraphed, thrown with emotion instead of technique. Time seemed to slow as William's body moved with fluid precision that defied his age. His left hand came up in a gentle arc, deflecting Crusher's punch just enough to send it harmlessly past his head. At the same moment, his right palm struck forward with surgical accuracy, connecting with a pressure point just below Crusher's sternum. The technique was called disrupting the center, and William had spent decades perfecting its application. Applied correctly, it could disrupt an opponent's balance and breathing, sending them crashing to the ground without causing permanent damage. Applied with full force, it could stop a heart. William held back. Crusher's eyes went wide as the air exploded from his lungs. His massive frame folded in on itself as he dropped to his knees, gasping like a fish out of water. The commissary bag William had been holding clattered to the concrete floor, its contents spilling across the gray surface. The silence in the corridor was deafening. Crusher's crew stood frozen, unable to process what they had just witnessed. Their invincible leader, the man who had ruled this block through fear and violence for 7 years, was on his knees in front of an elderly inmate who looked like he should be playing chess in a retirement home somewhere. William looked down at Crusher with something that might have been pity. "I asked you nicely," he said, his voice still calm and controlled. "All I wanted was to pass through." Crusher struggled to his feet, his face red with embarrassment and rage. The humiliation burned worse than the pain in his chest. Every eye in the corridor was on him, waiting to see how the king would respond to being dethroned by someone's grandfather. "You," he wheezed, pointing a shaking finger at William, "are dead. You hear me, old man? Dead." But even as he made the threat, Crusher knew something fundamental had changed. The aura of invincibility that had protected him for so long had been shattered in front of everyone. Word would spread through every cell block by evening. The unstoppable Crusher had been brought low by a man old enough to be his grandfather. William picked up his spilled commissary items methodically, placing each one back in the bag with careful precision. The inmates in the corridor parted before him like water, their eyes following his every movement. Some looked at him with newfound respect, others with curiosity, and more than a few with the kind of fear they had once reserved for Crusher alone. As William walked calmly back toward his cell, conversations slowly resumed around him. But they were different now, hushed, careful. The power structure that had governed Cell Block D for years had been turned upside down in the span of 30 seconds. Crusher and his crew retreated to their usual corner, but the swagger was gone. They huddled together, speaking in low voices, planning their revenge because, in a place like this, what had happened couldn't be allowed to stand. The old man had embarrassed Crusher in front of everyone, and that meant war. But William seemed oblivious to the storm gathering around him. His awareness, however, was absolute. He could feel the hostile stares, hear the whispered conversations, sense the violence building like pressure in a boiler. He had hoped to serve his time quietly, to keep his head down and count the days until his release. But 52 years of teaching martial arts had taught him that some conflicts were unavoidable. When faced with a bully, you had two choices: submit or stand your ground. William Torres had never been one to submit. Word of the corridor incident spread through Ridgemont like wildfire. By evening, inmates from other blocks were finding excuses to walk past Cell Block D, hoping to catch a glimpse of the elderly man who had humbled Crusher Davis. The story grew with each telling. Some said William had used ancient pressure points. Others claimed he was a former CIA operative. The truth was somehow both simpler and more impressive. That night, as William lay on his narrow bunk reading a worn paperback novel, Anthony whispered across the darkness of their cell, "Is it true what everyone's saying about what you did to Crusher?" William closed his book and set it aside. For a moment he was quiet, lost in memories of a different life. Training sessions that lasted until dawn. Students who looked up to him with respect and admiration, a world where his skills were used to protect and teach, not to survive. I was an instructor, he said finally without looking up, for a very long time. What did you teach? Discipline, control, how to find strength in stillness? Anthony was quiet for a while, processing this information. Finally, he spoke again, his voice barely audible above the distant sounds of the prison settling into night. Crusher's going to come for you. Him and his whole crew. They can't let what happened today stand. William stared up at the ceiling where a thin shaft of light from the corridor painted geometric patterns on the concrete. He had known this moment would come from the instant he decided to defend himself. The only question was when and how Crusher would make his move. I know, William said simply. Aren't you scared? William considered the question carefully. Fear was a natural response to danger, but it was also a choice. You could let it paralyze you, or you could acknowledge it and move forward anyway. Fear is just information, he said finally. It tells you to be prepared, but it doesn't have to control your actions. The next morning brought new challenges as word of the previous day's events continued to ripple through the prison ecosystem. Guards who had previously ignored William now watched him with curious eyes. Some inmates approached him with respect. Others kept their distance, and a few made subtle offers of alliance that he politely declined. But the most significant change was in Crusher himself. The big man moved differently now, his usual confident swagger replaced by something harder, more desperate. He had spent 7 years building his reputation on the foundation of being untouchable, and that foundation had cracked in full view of everyone who mattered. During morning count, William sat alone at a corner table, methodically eating his breakfast while observing the dynamics playing out around him. Crusher's crew had expanded overnight, drawing in members from other gangs who sensed opportunity in the chaos. Alliances were forming and shifting like sand in an hourglass. The attack, when it came, was swift and coordinated. 3 men approached William's table from different directions, moving with the practiced efficiency of predators who had done this before. But William's training had prepared him for exactly this scenario. Multiple attackers, limited space, innocent bystanders nearby. The first man reached for William's shoulder, intending to pin him in place while the others moved in. What he found instead was empty air as William flowed sideways like water, his movement so smooth it seemed effortless. The attacker's momentum carried him forward into the metal table edge with a sickening crack of ribs against steel. The second man swung a makeshift weapon fashioned from a toothbrush handle and razor blade. William caught his wrist mid-swing, applied pressure to a nerve cluster, and watched the weapon clatter to the floor as its wielder collapsed, screaming. The third attacker hesitated for just a moment, seeing his companions neutralized so quickly. That moment of doubt was all William needed. A swift strike to the solar plexus doubled the man over, and a gentle push sent him crashing into a nearby table where other inmates scattered to avoid the chaos. The entire encounter lasted less than 15 seconds. 3 men lay groaning on the cafeteria floor, while William calmly returned to his breakfast, his breathing barely elevated, his expression unchanged. The cafeteria had fallen completely silent. Even the guards stood frozen, trying to process what they had just witnessed. This wasn't the wild brawling they were used to seeing. This was something else entirely. Precise, controlled, devastating. Crusher watched from across the room, his face a mask of rage and frustration. His carefully planned ambush had failed spectacularly, and now his reputation hung by an even thinner thread. The old man wasn't just dangerous, he was untouchable. As the guards finally moved to restore order in the cafeteria, William was escorted to solitary confinement. Standard procedure after any violent incident, regardless of who started it or how it ended. The isolation cell was 8 feet by 10 feet of concrete and steel with a narrow bed, a steel toilet, and walls that seemed to press inward with the weight of complete silence. Most inmates emerged from solitary broken, their minds shattered by the crushing loneliness. But William used the time differently. He meditated. He practiced forms in the cramped space, his movements precise despite the limitations. He centered himself for what he knew would come next. 72 hours later, when William emerged from solitary, the prison felt different. Conversation stopped when he passed. Even the guards treated him with a cautious respect that hadn't been there before. Word of the cafeteria incident had spread beyond Ridgemont's walls, carried by transferred inmates and visiting family members. Anthony was waiting in their cell, his face a mixture of relief and concern. "Man, I thought they might never let you out. The whole block's been talking about what you did to those three guys. They're saying you moved like something out of a movie." William settled onto his bunk and opened his book. "Violence should always be the last option, Anthony, but when it becomes necessary, it should be swift and decisive. Is Crusher still planning his next move?" William nodded grimly. "He's calling in favors from every gang in the prison. White supremacists, Latin kings, even some of the crews that usually don't work with outsiders. He's promising them territory, commissary money, whatever it takes." The weight of this revelation settled over Anthony like a heavy blanket. "How many men is he gathering?" 25, maybe 35. All serious players with nothing to lose." William closed his eyes and tried to find the center of calm that had sustained him through decades of teaching and training. But for the first time since arriving at Ridgemont, he felt the weight of genuine concern settling on his shoulders. 35 violent men, armed and organized, all focused on one elderly martial artist who just wanted to serve his time in peace. Even with all his training and experience, William knew that some battles couldn't be won through skill alone. The question wasn't whether he could survive what was coming. The question was how many others would be hurt in the process, and whether standing his ground was worth the price that others might pay. That evening, as word spread through every cell block about Crusher's growing alliance, William sat quietly on his bunk, knowing that tomorrow would bring the storm he had been trying to avoid. The whispers carried details of dangerous men from every corner of the prison who had agreed to participate in what was being called the biggest coordinated attack in Ridgemont's history. Anthony paced nervously in their small cell, occasionally glancing at William with a mixture of awe and terror. "Man, they're saying Crusher's got guys coming from maximum security. Lifers with nothing to lose. Why don't you just ask for protective custody? Get transferred out of here." William looked up from the meditation pose he had assumed on his thin mattress. "Running away doesn't solve the problem, Anthony. It just moves it somewhere else. But this isn't your fight anymore. This is war. It became my fight the moment I decided not to let Crusher humiliate me," William replied calmly. "Everything that's happened since then has been a consequence of that choice." Anthony stopped pacing. There was something in the old man's words, a certainty that spoke of a man who had faced impossible odds before and found a way through them. "You really think you can take on 35 guys?" William was quiet for a long moment, his eyes distant. "When I was younger, I might have believed I could. Age teaches you humility, but sometimes you don't fight because you think you can win. You fight because it's the right thing to do." The morning came with an eerie quiet that settled over cell block D, like fog before a storm. William rose at dawn as he always did, but today felt different. The air carried tension so thick you could taste it. Even the guards seemed on edge, their usual casual demeanor replaced by alert watchfulness. Anthony had barely slept, his eyes darting to the cell door every few minutes. "They're coming today," he whispered. "Everyone knows it. The whole prison's holding its breath." William nodded slowly, folding his blanket with the same precise movements he had performed every morning for months. "Then today we find out what we're really made of." As the cell doors opened for morning count, the usual shuffle of feet and murmur of voices was replaced by an unnatural silence. Inmates moved carefully, keeping their heads down, sensing that something explosive was about to happen. Even the most hardened criminals knew when to stay out of the way. William walked toward the common area with measured steps, his breathing controlled, his mind centered. He could feel the weight of hundreds of eyes on him, some filled with curiosity, others with fear, and more than a few with the hungry anticipation of spectators waiting for blood. The common room felt like a powder keg waiting for a spark. Crusher sat in his usual corner, but today he wasn't alone. The faces surrounding him told the story of every alliance he had forged, every favor he had called in, every threat he had made. White supremacist soldiers with swastika tattoos, Latino gang enforcers with dead eyes, Black gang members who had set aside their usual hatred of Crusher's crew for the promise of territory and respect. William entered the room and found a chair in the center, not hiding in a corner, not seeking protection near the guards, right in the middle where everyone could see him, where there was nowhere to run. He sat down and opened his book, as if this were just another ordinary morning. The attack came without warning. Crusher's signal was subtle, just a slight nod of his head, but it unleashed chaos. Men rose from chairs throughout the room, moving with coordinated precision toward the elderly man, sitting calmly with his worn paperback. What happened next would be whispered about in prisons across 5 states for decades to come. William moved like water flowing around stones, his body shifting and turning with fluid grace that seemed to defy the laws of physics. The first attacker's shank thrust met empty air as William stepped aside, his palms striking with surgical precision at pressure points that dropped the man instantly. 2 more came from his left, swinging makeshift weapons with lethal intent. William ducked low, swept one man's legs, and used his falling body to block the other's strike. His elbow found ribs, his knee found a solar plexus, and both attackers crumpled. The room erupted into complete pandemonium as more men joined the assault. But William was no longer fighting individuals. He was fighting the mob itself, using their numbers against them, turning their aggression into a weapon that struck down their own allies. His movements were poetry, written in violence, each technique flowing seamlessly into the next. A man with a razor-wire garrote tried to slip behind him. William sensed the movement, spun with impossible speed, and delivered a strike to the attacker's wrist that sent the weapon flying. Another came with a sharpened spoon, thrusting toward William's ribs. The old man redirected the attack, used the attacker's momentum against him, and sent him crashing into a concrete pillar. Decades of training had prepared him not just for combat, but for this exact moment when skill would face overwhelming odds and emerge victorious through pure discipline and understanding. Every breath was controlled. Every movement had purpose. Every strike was calculated to disable without killing. A massive man with arms like tree trunks charged forward, intending to tackle William to the ground where the others could finish him. William waited until the last possible second, then stepped aside and guided the charging bull into a metal table with enough force to bend the steel legs. 2 more attackers coordinated their assault, coming at him from opposite sides simultaneously. William dropped to one knee, swept both their legs in a single circular motion, then rose with uppercut strikes that left them both unconscious before they hit the floor. The tide was turning. What had started as a coordinated assault was becoming a rout. Men who had entered the fray with confidence were now backing away, their eyes wide with disbelief. This wasn't the confused brawling they were used to. This was something beyond their comprehension. Crusher watched in horror as his carefully assembled army was systematically dismantled by one 72-year-old man. The alliance he had spent weeks building was crumbling in real time. His reputation, already damaged, was being obliterated in front of everyone who mattered. A final group of 6 men rushed William simultaneously, hoping that sheer numbers would overwhelm even his incredible skill. They came at him like a wave, weapons raised, voices screaming with desperate fury. William became a hurricane, spinning and striking with movements too fast for the human eye to follow. Bodies flew in every direction, weapons clattered across the concrete floor. In less than 12 seconds, all 6 attackers were down. The common room fell silent except for the groaning of injured men and the sound of approaching boots as guards finally arrived with riot gear. William stood in the center of the room, his orange jumpsuit torn, but his breathing steady, surrounded by the unconscious and writhing forms of Crusher's army. Guards rushed in, expecting to find a massacre. Instead, they found something they had never seen before. One man standing calmly while 35 others lay defeated around him. Not dead, just thoroughly, completely beaten. Crusher himself lay unconscious near the overturned furniture. His Grand Alliance shattered along with his reputation. The king of Cell Block D had been dethroned not by another gang leader, but by a man old enough to be his grandfather. Captain Martinez, the head of security, looked around at the destruction in amazement. "What the hell happened here?" William straightened his torn shirt and picked up his fallen book. "Disagreement over seating arrangements," he said calmly. "It got out of hand." As William was led away in handcuffs, every inmate in that common room knew they had witnessed something that would define their understanding of strength for the rest of their lives. This wasn't about size or numbers or reputation. This was about discipline, skill, and the quiet confidence that comes from decades of dedicated training. The legend of William Torres was born in that moment. But more importantly, so was a lesson that would echo through every cell block in the prison. Never judge a book by its cover. Never mistake quiet dignity for weakness. And never, ever underestimate what an old man with nothing left to lose might be capable of when pushed too far. In the weeks that followed, William Torres became a legend within the walls of Ridgemont Federal Correctional Institution. Not because he sought power or control, but because he had shown that true strength comes from discipline, that real power flows from inner peace, and that sometimes the most dangerous person in the room is the one who looks the least threatening. He served the remainder of his sentence without incident, teaching meditation classes in the library and showing younger inmates that there was a path beyond violence. When his release day finally came, William walked out of those steel doors the same way he had walked in, with quiet dignity and unshakable calm. The lesson he left behind echoed through every cell block. Never judge a man by his appearance, because you never know what kind of power lies beneath a gentle exterior. Sometimes the greatest warriors are the ones who choose not to fight until the moment comes when they have no other choice. If you enjoyed this story, make sure to subscribe to Behind Bar Tales for more incredible prison stories. Drop a comment below and let us know what you thought. Until next time.